Hello everyone, welcome to another edition of the Orthodox Nationalist. This is Matthew Raphael Johnson, and it is April 22nd, 2020. I have still yet to receive my stimulus check from the federal government. The IRS claims that I have not filed my taxes from last year, which of course I have. I predicted that they were going to figure out some way to keep the check from reaching me. I predicted this a month ago, 2 months ago, and when this first started and was first announced from the Trump administration, and it shouldn't surprise you. So a few bucks maybe from yours wouldn't hurt. I don't know if I'm ever going to receive one, whether it be a paper check or anything, because this is what they're claiming, and I know that I'm not the only one who's getting that runaround from the IRS. Anyway, what I want to talk about today is something that's been really one of the few non-COVID-19 issues that have hit the front page. I mean, it's indirectly connected to it. Last week, maybe 2 weeks ago, blowhard Senator Lindsey Graham declared his personal war against China. He claims that China has somehow sponsored this virus, which makes very little sense since it's killed many, many Chinese and has brought the economy down to some extent. As some of you know, oil, I think, is now in the negative numbers in its per barrel cost price. I just published an article showing that Russia is not dependent on oil. So now we're going to see if I'm right or not. But Lindsey Graham said this on Fox News on April 10th. He said, "The first thing I want to do is get the U.S. Senate on record where we don't blame Trump, we blame China. The Chinese government is responsible for 16,000 American deaths and 17 million unemployed. It's the Chinese government and the way they behave that led to this pandemic. This is the third one to come out of China." I assume he means the third disease. Now, these have become infamous by now, but the giveaway to his agenda is mentioning the unemployed. And of course, the number is far higher than 17 million, but this is evidence that they're trying to deflect attention from the destruction of an economy that's been on the brink for years. That's the entire purpose here. The U.S. has been in a depression for a very long time, deliberately underreporting unemployment, underemployment, inflation. But the anti-Chinese talk is something relatively new. And I've defended China in this respect. And I'm telling you that they're a national socialist, or at least a national Bolshevik state, having shed Marxism a long time ago. But since most people don't know that, they still act like Mao's in charge. So what's going to happen is the U.S. is at least going to attempt to pick a fight with the Chinese to rebuild the economy once this crisis is over, and of course even attempt to blame them for it when the economy finally collapses officially, assuming that's ever reported that way. So the right wing is able to condemn their red background, while the left can talk about their discrimination against non-Chinese. I don't know if you've heard of the recent articles in the New York Times about how anti-black they are, anti-African they are, which apparently had been undetected for decades until it was needed to buttress the regime's hatred for the Chinese system and its success. So this is how the regime, when they're preparing for war, goes to both factions in American politics. The Taliban, they did the same thing. So they went to the left and said they're misogynists. They went to the right and said they were anti-American. This was not the case when Mao was running China. So China will be blamed for everything, including the possible war. But since people don't know what's going on, this isn't 1964 anymore. This is going to be used, and Johnson's law, as always, is going to be proven correct. China has not been a communist state in the Leninist sense for a very long time. Mao died in 1976, In 1978, a new constitution was written. The moment Deng Xiaoping became supreme leader, all of Mao's people were purged. Actually, they had been purged prior to that. And a new, more or less pragmatic leadership took over and began building a nationalist rather than Marxist state. 1978, the third plenum of the 11th Party Congress condemned all of it. Condemned the Soviet Union. I should say in 82, the 12th Congress condemned the USSR and the USA for imperialism. Both materialist socialism and liberalism were officially condemned. And by eliminating Marxism, they made the claim that, well, the exploiting class has been destroyed, therefore the class war is over. Now, after Mao's death, the Gang of Four took over, which included Mao's wife, trying to revert to Maoism and Stalinism, but this was rejected. In fact, not just rejected, but these guys were put on trial for treason. They were not executed. Their sentences were commuted, but Deng Xiaoping was condemned for his rejection of Mao and the revolution. The military had its budget cut drastically. Greater freedom was permitted. It even restored ranks back into the army again. And exiled Deng in 2006 wrote the book The Decline of Communism in China, where he goes to great lengths to explain this in depth. The concept of socialism with Chinese characteristics is their conception of National Socialism. That's what this means. Modernizing the forces of production in the so-called four modernizations. And this was a strong national idea. And the quote is, to inculcate high ideals, moral integrity, a good education, a strong sense of discipline, and developing a national, scientific, and popular socialist culture geared towards the needs of modernization, the world, and of the future. And patriotism was the essential category, and internationalism was also condemned in these congresses in the early 80s. See, what Deng Xiaoping said is that he refused to connect a market economy with capitalism, and he's right to do it. He also rejected the connection between state planning and socialism. He said this, early on he said, planning and market forces are not the essential differences between socialism and capitalism. A planned economy is not the definition of socialism because there is planning under capitalism. The market economy happens under socialism too. Planning and market forces are both ways of controlling economic activity. And then Liu Rongu, who was the theorist at the time, official theorist at the time, said that Marx and Engels never formulated any systematic theory on the development of the non-Western world. In other words, European and Jewish theory on industry had no relevance to China. And this is where the anti-colonial style nationalism developed. Liberalism was condemned, as always, as a violent, totalitarian, and imperial ideology. And as I said, Soviet Leninism was also condemned. So they created the so-called social market, which has been a success. And it's funny to hear these conservatives condemn China from a liberal point of view, not realizing that when these governments draw a line in the sand against America, they're drawing a line against liberalism, because that's what the U.S. is. So the gaps, now that Marx, Lenin, and Mao had been removed from public discourse, nationalism filled in those gaps. Now, some of the names that were used symbolically, like you see in Belarus and even the Donbass today, but ideology was cast aside in favor of pragmatism. In fact, Deng Xiaoping even condemned Maoism, claiming that it shared poverty, which had always been a conservative talking point. Hugo Feng said that Mao needed to be abandoned slowly for some kind of continuity, and Chen Yong and other Maoists were purged quite violently. He even said that some of these reformist ideas are part of the common heritage of mankind and not specifically tied to ideology, which, by the way, is a natural law argument. China radically decentralized its system, and local leaders, often in defiance of the state, moved away from Mao, building a private economy and even a private media. Chinese localities would try out different policies, and if it's successful, they'd be adopted in the capital. Singapore, Taiwan, South Korea, under their military governments, these were studied very carefully. Deng Xiaoping had to admit early on that Taiwan's per capita GDP was 300% higher than China, and therefore Maoism was a failure. You'd go to prison for saying that years before. So you had the Russian-style centralized management only at the macro level, but nowhere else. He condemned the mass campaign style of Mao, but in rejecting Leninism, macro-level management was kind of indirect. And if you read Robert Lawrence's How China's Leaders Think, the inside story of China's past, current, and future leaders in 2011, they go into great detail, as well as Ronald Coase's How China Became Capitalist, which came out in 2012. So a great degree of decentralization was put into city politics, and provinces and cities were permitted to invest and build industries that they considered the most profitable, given local resources. The stress was on light manufacturing, which means consumer goods. So Deng's reforms shifted China's development strategy to emphasize the consumer, and this built the export-led economy, which of course is the opposite of Lenin's model. What began to happen is that the West, that is to say the U.S., began to grow suspicious of China. American hostility to China is in exact proportion to the extent which since China abandoned Maoism and Leninism. There was no condemnation of China before this, except in Korea, while Mao was slaughtering people. The minute they stopped, and the minute they purged Maoists from government, all of a sudden the U.S. gets very upset because they saw a national socialist-style government being formed. So, in building this export-based economy, what they ended up doing was, rather to avoid the creation of this liberal bourgeoisie in China that would then eventually take over the state stepped in and reinvested profits. So this avoided the obnoxious oligarchs that, took over in Russia and today in Ukraine, of course, the U.S. And this is how China avoided the destruction that Russia suffered a decade later. We're still in the 80s here. The state had a very strong role. The state is extremely important in economic development in the developing world. So again, China and Belarus both have this in common. The other thing to keep in mind is that the capital invested in heavy industry came from the local banking system. Remember, China's currency is strictly state-controlled, which is why when Soros bankrupted the Thai economy in 1997, China was not affected. But most of the capital that built Chinese industry came from consumer deposits, not foreign loans or the IMF. If you read Richard Baum's Burying Mao, Chinese Politics in the Age of Deng Xiaoping, came out in 1996, he explains where the Chinese had politely declined the assistance of the IMF because the IMF, of course, demanded to take over all national policy and eliminate any nationalist elements. So the reallocation of profits, except through taxation, through the banking system, built the advanced state banking system, of course, built these advanced industries that were encouraged but not openly mandated. But what held it all together? And this was the strong sense of national identity, and the Han elite took over the Chinese economy, which is, 90% of the population anyway. But the short-term thinking of the bourgeoisie was eliminated. So all of a sudden, the West began to condemn Chinese communism years after Nixon's visit. And then the CIA, because of this, began to pour money into the Tibetan national movement and the Islamic groups in Western China. That was when the Dalai Lama was granted a CIA stipend of $250,000 a year, which, by the way, is on budget. And if some of you remember, all of a sudden, Buddhism became the national craze in America. And the Dalai Lama's picture is plastered everywhere. And if you read Deng Xiaoping and the Transformation of China by Ezra Vogel, which came out in 2011, you'll read about this in detail. The book also, The Chinese Reassessment of Socialism, written by Sun Yat a few years ago, agrees with me. And basically what he said is He said, if pluralism pertained to the fundamental character of a polity, then there was little pluralism in Western democracies because competing groups all agreed on the basic framework of capitalism. If pluralism referred to diverse social groups in society, then it existed not only in the West but also in the East. Following this logic, conservative critics concluded that rather than advocating diversity of opinions among social groups on an equal footing, bourgeois liberals actually propounded the dominance of their own version of social order. Specifically, this would favor the so-called middle class to the benefit of political ambitions of leading bourgeois liberals, who would have the leisure and finances to run for political office. In other words, the very idea of liberalism rests on oligarchy, because liberalism allegedly stresses the subjective factor in politics and the nominalist insistence on the unattainability of truth. Whoever then has the most money, the most power, takes over the government. This is how oligarchy comes into existence. So socialism is legitimate in the national sense because it stresses that which is social over either that which comes from the state versus the individual. So Sun Yat's The Chinese Reassessment of Socialism explains the nationalist development. The other anti-liberal measure at the time was the so-called the Strike Hard campaign. They realized that liberalism and the market encourage crime and drugs, since it encourages personal self-seeking. Just like in the Opium Wars, the West began pushing drugs in China during this period of time. They never did this when Mao was in charge. And it brings out the self-destructive streak in a lot of people. So these institutions that advocated, things like easy divorce, the decadent aspects of Western life were all destroyed. The last 15 years, up until this point, you had a huge spike in divorce rates. And so the Peking government did everything it could to keep families together. It banned the no-fault divorces, claiming that any divorce has to be based on cause, not just the fleeting demands of so-called liberated women. And of course, Mao was screaming in protest from wherever he was. The Strike Hard campaign is still going on today. And it's being used against the CIA's financed secessionist movements in the far West, as well as liberal institutions in China itself. So when Chinese leaders use terms even like socialism and communism, understand it's been dismantled already. These terms don't mean what most people think it does. Terms like communism have been used for so long that's really just because this is the vocabulary everyone's used to. In China, the book China in Search of a Harmonious Society, which came out in 2008, is also worthwhile. So in early 1982, this is all roughly when this is going on, the party laid out 3 loves campaign. Love the party, love socialism, and love the motherland. Now, Chinese nationalism was defined as anti-imperialist and anti-feudal. Now, the term feudal, meaning feudalism, was aimed at Tibetan Buddhist history, which Peking always said was a feudal theocracy, so to speak. So what you have by the mid-80s, the Chinese party is sounding exactly like the Ba'ath Party in Syria, or the Social Nationalist Party in Lebanon. So it made it China a anti-globalist force because globalism was associated with liberalism, which of course is true. Then the Central Research Office began putting out films and stuff, promoting nationalism of all types. Some of these films, glorifying the fight against Western liberalism or the Japanese or anything else like this. And even students had to start singing the national anthem. All kinds of patriotic lessons were added to the school system. The national flag was promoted. Now, under Mao, this was all condemned as not being internationalist enough, because nationalism had been banned under Mao like it had been under all the Soviet dictators. So the party concluded in 1983 that among patriotism, collectivism, socialism, and communism, patriotism has peculiar features and functions. Patriotism is a banner of greatest appeal. So Deng Xiaoping put it this way. He said, some have said that not loving socialism is not the same as not loving one's motherland. Is the motherland something abstract? If you do not love New China, led by the party, what motherland do you love? Now, the very fact that he called it New China he declared Mao finally dead. Nationalism is socialist by definition, because individualism is evidence of disintegration. So Deng Xiaoping said, "One cannot demonstrate that one loves the motherland if one shows no deep love for the socialist system and the party. In short, in our times, loving the party is the highest expression of Chinese patriotism." So this isn't my personal opinion. This is official Chinese policy. Now, the West's response to all this was something called Operation Yellowbird. This was a CIA operation based in Hong Kong, which helped build the so-called Tiananmen Square movement. Now, the U.S. didn't say a word when Mao killed 30 million people, or when he exploded a nuclear device in 1964. However, once China switched to nationalism, all of a sudden, the CIA is operating in the country. Operation Yellowbird was not only building the Tiananmen Square movement, but also sneaking them out of the country once it ended. Remember, these student protests in '89, the same year that the Soviet Union began to collapse, these were elite students, as is the case in South Korea. China remained firm rather than go down the same path as the Eastern Bloc had done. And of course, the faster economic growth developed, the same middle-class bourgeois liberals, although not nearly as numerous as elsewhere, still developed. And the CIA was condemning them in their own official documents in '89, claiming that this needs to end. Because China is no longer communist, it has to be destroyed. But one of the protest leaders, again, the Tiananmen Square massacre never occurred. Again, that's not my opinion. That's also the opinion of the BBC and NBC News. Many of you have heard the descriptions of soldiers killing, thousands of people, tanks, running over people. I have several papers on this. And a lot of the nonsense simply covers over the fact that the Chinese army lost over 100 armored vehicles to the so-called unarmed protesters. And the BBC at the time was talking about shooting ambulance drivers and lines of protesters being machine gunned, and yet somehow still figuring out ways to destroy APCs and tanks and even shooting down helicopters, which did not, of course, make it into the Western press. In 2016, Caleb Maupin, one of the major reporters at the time, said this: "Regardless of how many times the Tiananmen narrative is refuted, Western media continues to repeat it. In the words of Nicholas Kristof, James Miles, the Chinese government, the eyewitness accounts of the Chilean diplomats are simply ignored. An event that was far more complex, involving lots of confusion and violence on both sides, has been retold to Western audiences as some kind of classical tragedy. The reality, of course, of what occurred is not even mentioned." And the Telegraph, the UK Telegraph, admitted this. Malcolm Moore, who wrote "No Bloodshed Inside Tiananmen Square" on June 4th, 2011. And he writes, and by the way, and James Miles, who also worked for the BBC, he said that he might have given the wrong impression. There was no massacre in Tiananmen Square that day. But Malcolm Moore, also writing for the Telegraph, says the army came up against an elaborate system of blockades described in a cable from May 21st, '89, which allowed students to control most of central Peking. Inside the square itself, the Chilean diplomat, because the Chilean embassy was right there, watched the military enter the square and observed no mass firing of weapons into the crowds, but sporadic gunfire was heard elsewhere. Most of the troops entering into the square were armed only with anti-riot gear, clubs and truncheons and that kind of thing. They were backed by armed soldiers. Leaders of the protests, including Liu Xiaobo, urged the students to depart the square, and the students left the square through the southeast corner. And they were always claiming that these reporters who were in the Peking Hotel were able to watch what happened, but the Peking Hotel cannot view the square. I always make fun of that stupid picture of the guy standing in front of this line of tanks. Everyone knows that picture. Well, it's ridiculous. First of all, including the guy who took the picture, says the tanks were leaving the square at the time. They weren't going to it, they were coming from it. Why didn't they run the guy down? Did they know that they were being watched? And if they had just killed people in the square, how was this guy able to block? Why didn't they just run him over? Did this guy know he was being filmed? He probably did. But if they were willing to, stop rather than run him over, clearly they weren't just killing people on the square. Richard Roth of the CBS News said there was no Tiananmen Square massacre. Period. There is not a single picture of a Chinese soldier shooting into a crowd. There's no video of it. There's no picture of it. So somehow, this has been going on since April of '89, but no one bothered to pick up a camera. They noticed a few captured tank crews. They took pictures of a few dead soldiers. And there was a 1989 U.S. Embassy cable that also says that there was simply no massacre. How many Chinese soldiers were killed depends on who you read. The Washington Post talks about an armed, organized group, groups of maybe 100 to 150 people armed with Molotov cocktails, chains and things like that, very well organized into squads of 5. And this is when they were, torching buses and cars and things like that. And the gunfire was exchanged between the military and quote-unquote other forces that they never quite explain what that is or who the other forces are. Now remember, the Washington Post, these are the same people who were promoting the idea of the massacre at the time, claiming that there were shootouts between the army and these so-called other forces. Now, I think that the only embassy that could actually had a very good view of the square was in Chile. The Chilean embassy. Remember who was running Chile in 1989? That means Pinochet had given his embassy leave to say there was no massacre. These guys watched the whole thing unfold from an upper floor in there where the embassy is, and they said they saw shootouts, that there were armed guerrilla groups from all over the place shooting at Chinese soldiers, and of course the pictures that exist are all of military men having been shot. The article in Japan Times, which came out on July 21st, 2008, written by a former desk officer of the Australian Foreign Service, the article is called Birth of a Massacre Myth, that says, and not just Chile, but also the Spanish ambassador, Eugenio Brigalot, says there was no mass. So at this point, anyone who believes in Tiananmen Square is an idiot. There is simply no justification for it. Everyone who was there either didn't see it, there's not a single picture of it, and even the guys who had their clothes stripped off, some of these pictures were put in Western newspapers, they were soldiers. The soldiers, between 12 and 200, maybe more. It depends on who you read, how many soldiers were killed. There were more soldiers killed than students. And those who were armed and shooting at these guys and knocking out tanks, over 100 armored vehicles. I don't know how peaceful protesters can do this. But if you remember, one of the things that these so-called students were promoting was easy divorce, free love, all this kind of stuff that the party was fighting against. My big problem really with the party at the time was that they went with Rockefeller's one-child policy, even though the overwhelming majority of Chinese land area is completely empty. Chinese are crammed into a few cities. Tibet is almost completely empty. Western China is almost completely empty. So they're not overpopulated. They're just crammed into these cities like Shanghai and Peking and even places like Wuhan. Now, given all that, this is what you need to know in order to make sense out of the threats that Lindsey Graham and the Republican Party is putting out. This is the basic background information you have to have in order to even begin to make sense out of American policy. And it shows that, Lindsey Graham is full of it, because of course he mentions the Tiananmen myth. And they're still promoting this. And they're saying stupid things like, well, because Mao slaughtered all these people, which he most certainly did, the greatest mass murderer of all history. Therefore, the Chinese party is the exact same, which is equivocation. What was the Democratic Party in the U.S. in 1865? What's the Democratic Party now? So not only are they different, they're complete opposites of one another. But I'm telling you, just as World War II saved the U.S. from the Great Depression, the possibility of a war with China may save the U.S. from the same thing. Now, it's very possible that even the U.S. isn't this stupid. Last week, Sven Longshanks and I did the Daily Nationalist on the attempts to goad the Chinese into war, starting in February. They do this like once a month, but the one I was talking about occurred in February, of 2020, where the Poseidon spy plane taking pictures, but what the spy plane does is take pictures of its target mapping. In other words, who they're going to shoot and who they're going to destroy in the South China Sea, where of course the Chinese Navy has a huge presence. That's their territory. And this Poseidon plane was chased away, and the U.S. is claiming this is an act of war. Now, as far as the virus is concerned, a guy named Christopher Bedford had wrote something very stupid in the Federalist, which is George Mason University, and I think I've mentioned this elsewhere, claiming that there's a secret document out there that says the Chinese are understating the number of deaths. But he's not citing where this came from. And even the same thing National Review says incinerators are working around the clock, which, by the way, is not impossible. That's a dead giveaway. It's like this is coming from Radio Free Asia. Used to be CIA, now is Soros owned. Somehow they've discovered that funeral benefits are being given in huge numbers. And they've even said that funeral homes have to report cremation to local authorities twice daily. I've mentioned this before. How the hell could they possibly know this, but have no idea how many people have actually died? Now, various universities in China have canceled clinical trials because the fall of infections has been so substantial. Most of the clinical trials had actually been involved in China. I started in China, at the clinic in Wuhan and other places, but because there aren't enough people to try this on anymore, there are over 600 of these studies at one point, they can't test drugs. There's not that many people, so they can't test drugs on anyone anymore. So they've eliminated these publicly funded clinical trials. So all of a sudden, conspiracy theories are okay so long as they blame the Chinese. Well, I've said elsewhere, when this first hit in December, the first thing the Chinese government did was notify the World Health Organization. They said it's a case of pneumonia of unknown etiology. And that was even before the virus was identified. They shared all the genetic sequencing of the virus and sent it right to the WHO once it was discovered on January 7th, so the teams could work on immunization. Government leaders were notified, including Donald Trump, on January 23rd, less than 3 days after the first human-to-human transmission was made public. Immediately, 14 million people in Wuhan were quarantined, which was put in place just before the New Year, Chinese New Year, which is probably the largest annual migration in the globe at the time takes place. No one mentioned this at the time. 2 days later, limitations of activity for 50 million Chinese. Listen, if China couldn't keep a lid on the Tiananmen Square nonsense, then how can they keep a lid on this? How come USSR couldn't keep a lid on Chernobyl? Another sensationally reported event. The systems at the time were far more authoritarian than they are now. Not to mention the fact that China has a centralized disease and health database, which is available to everyone, doctors all over the planet. And foreign doctors have been in Wuhan for years. Wuhan is an international city that has its own private media. Academics were coming and going at the time, and no one has said anything like this. WHO said that China's response was the best that it had ever seen, even, putting out new standards, they said, for a rapid response. And that even the NSA, the CIA, all denied ever calling this a Chinese matter. So I have no idea what these neocons are talking about. Now, on April 17th, 2020, the local government in Wuhan revised the figures affected by the virus. The National Health Commission of China, the death toll in mainland China had been revised from 3,342 to 4,632. Total confirmed cases went from 82,367 to 82,692, according to the National Health Commission. And of course, it makes a lot of sense that they're going to do this, because initially the spread of this thing, before anyone knew what it was in January, really overwhelmed the Wuhan system. And overwhelmed hospitals, needed time to catch up. Now, the Global Times, which is a state, at least a partially state-owned newspaper, they've made it clear that over 100 Chinese officials have been punished and have lost their offices for incompetence in Wuhan. Then they ask other countries, have you done this in Italy or the US or elsewhere? As of March 17th, 342 officials at various levels, medical and otherwise, have been held accountable for malpractice and misconduct in the Yunnan province for doing the wrong thing and trying to control this thing. And, the central and local authorities have always been dealing with this effectively. And after the central government inspection team reviewed treatment and prevention procedures in Hubei province and elsewhere, and now, of course, the lockdown is over. So what these people have to claim now is that China is deliberately permitting the virus to spread, that they're deliberately destroying their own economy, that they are deliberately having as many people as possible die over this thing because they've lifted most of their travel restrictions already. So the point I'm trying to make is that the Chinese government has been revising their figures. Initially, it was simply too much for the government of Wuhan to when it first hit, to deal with effectively. A lot of people died at home. The Chinese have been completely open about this. They also needed to make sure that those who died actually had the virus and weren't just merely carriers, because most of us are carriers. Hospitals needed to catch up on records. And so by now, by the middle of April, the neocon claim has all faded away. There'd be no reason to announce a revision if it wasn't true, but it's not going to satisfy anyone no matter what they do. And the Global Times had an April 11th article called "Nobody Accountable in U.S. Despite Rising Virus Deaths." And it's also that article they mentioned that by February 5th, more than 100 officials throughout China have been punished. And they published this on April 11th, and yet in the U.S. or Italy or elsewhere, not one person has been had their lost their job or whatever happened for one reason or another. So, which by the way suggests the nature of this virus, that no one has been punished. But in China, you now have hundreds of people who have been. Both the CIA and the NSA have denied that this is something that the Chinese deliberately did. And it's idiotic to think this, because it means that the Chinese deliberately destroyed their own economy. Not even the neocons can be this stupid. So, what have I said here? I want to remind my readers, whether they're hostile about this or not, of what Johnson's law is. And it's a serious matter. I formulated it in 2003, and it's been cited in a bunch of places. It simply states that the more obscure or complex the phenomenon, or obscure the country where it's taking place, the easier it is for the media to lie about it, because there's so few people to tell them otherwise. Another way of putting it is that the more obscure the country or the political system, and especially something technical like a virus, and the more complex these things are, it's not just they could lie about it and get away with it, but now they have incentive to simply make mistakes about it. Not even deliberately lying, just simply they don't know. These people aren't specialists in these countries. So ultimately it all comes down to the fact that there's no incentive for reporters to exercise due diligence, since so few can correct them if they're wrong. So they could use their imagination to fill in the large blanks in their knowledge. So the absurdity about China, I've reduced this to 16 points. These are the absurdities that you have to believe in order to accept the neocon view of that this is all China's fault. Number one, that China is a Leninist state, which I've already shown in great detail and cited the books that have all of the internal documents and everything else. That is simply not true. Number two, that China slaughters its own people for no reason. No one has ever mentioned what interest the Chinese have in doing this to themselves. And as a correlate, number three, that China has destroyed its own economy for no reason. If this was anything other than something that took them by surprise. Hubei's trade volume in that region has gone down 20% in the first quarter of 2020. So Lindsey Graham has to explain why they would destroy their own economy. Number four, that somehow China has a political interest in destroying the lives of millions of people in its most advanced and significant cities. Number five, China's Communist Party is the same as it was in 1965, which again I've already showed is absurd. The whole point of maintaining a one-party state is to make sure China doesn't go down the same road that Russia did in the early 90s. Number six, that China has a totally controlled media and the US does not. Again, you have to believe that. China has as much of a private media as anybody else. Every city has a privately owned newspaper. Yeah, sometimes they're bullied by the state. That's the case everywhere. That's the case in the US and everywhere else. The US has, I believe, far more of a controlled media than the Chinese does, and has just as much state control over it as anywhere else. Number seven, you have to believe that these revisions that the Chinese health service has put out in Wuhan are just propaganda. That they're going to revise these numbers for fun, or just to fool people. Number eight, that China could put a lid on these events in a multinational city with its own private media establishment, as well as places like the Global Times, which are at least partially state-owned. Number nine, that China can put a lid on events in a multinational city filled with academics from all over the world, medical or otherwise. You have to believe that too. You have to believe, number 10, that there's a secret CIA report proving China is lying about its death rate. I don't know why they would do this if they're already revising the numbers up. You have to also believe, 11, that the Federalist and National Review are not corporate media. Because they claim corporate media is involved in covering for China for some reason. And we all know the media has been attacking China at least since Tiananmen Square. Number 12, because the WHO defends the Chinese response, they must somehow be in bed with the Chinese government, although no one explains how that would be or why that would be. Number 13, that the virus was created in China for some reason, rather than just first discovered there. Lots of people work in that lab, not just Chinese people. The lab in Wuhan was partly financed by the US, after all. Not only did it have state funding, it had private funding as well from other governments as well as other universities, especially in America. So even if you could show that somehow this was created in the Wuhan lab, well, there's a lot of other countries who were involved in this and academics who were something other than Chinese. As I said elsewhere, on the Dugan talk I gave last week, or the week before, that the main issue is that the Chinese are saying the exact same thing about the U.S. that the U.S. is saying about the Chinese. Because if anyone has suffered here, China has suffered. I don't think any country has seen a loss economically as the Chinese have. And we know that their supply system was fairly, fragile to begin with. Number 14, that the U.S. has no incentive to lie about a foreign power it hates, and also has no incentive to deflect blame for the virus and economic depression that comes from it. Well, of course the U.S. has incentive to do this. Number 15, that the American media is well versed in Chinese history and has the highest level of sources for its reporting in Wuhan, which of course is certainly not the case. And finally, number 16, that American intelligence is to be trusted in dealing with its enemies and has a record of truthfulness in this respect. So I could come up with a lot more than this, but these are the 16 ridiculous things that you have to believe in order for the Lindsey Graham's idea to be true. And I've already mentioned the P-8A Poseidon. We talked about the so-called laser beam that was shot at it as it was taking pictures of Chinese military positions in these artificial islands in the South China Sea. We talked about the laser targeting device that was kind of shot through the Poseidon plane. And then these guys got all scared and said, well, this could have harmed our systems. Now, this is Boeing who made this thing, so given recent events, who knows, maybe it is enough to bring it down, because a lot of Boeing planes are going down these days. But this is their most advanced spy plane and their most advanced technology, clearly engaged in hostile actions against China in the South China Sea. And that's their territory anyway. And of course the Chinese. So this just happened in February. This is around the time that this whole thing first started. Therefore, the U.S. is clearly taking a fight. This has been going on for a while, but the same thing happened in February of 2020 in the Eastern Mediterranean, taking pictures of Russian positions in Syria and to some extent the Turkish military. And this happened on the naval level in the Gulf in Middle East. And the Iranians are the ones kind of chasing away ships that are similar to the USS Liberty. These are spy ships, or the one that was captured in '68 in North Korea. They claimed the Pueblo, which I've actually dealt with in great detail. The point of all of this, again, this has been going on for a while, but it's exploded since the virus was first discovered, and the U.S., looking at a collapsed economy, looking at a lot of problems in terms of how this situation is being handled, now needs someone to blame. And so the U.S. is goading the Chinese into war. The Chinese had every right to shoot this plane down. Because if they would have done that, because it was clearly a hostile military operation. Because again, one of the things that this jet does is take pictures of, in very advanced ways, in great detail. They could tell the difference between typical, noise in the ocean versus a submarine, or even a tiny little periscope coming up out of the water. So this was clear, and they were taking pictures. And one of the things that this jet does is target mapping. In other words, it's used prior to a military attack. And this is why they had a reason to take action. And the Chinese, of course, have been extremely restrained in this respect. And what the U.S. would have done, had the Chinese taken more drastic action, is they would have said this wasn't a spy plane at all. They would have said this is a commercial passenger jet, and the savage red gooks, knocked it out of the air for no good reason. It would have been the absolute, perfect excuse for war. And the Chinese are aware of this, and there's no question that the military is saying do not play into their hands here. So here's the broader point of what's going on. The nationalist movement, thanks to me, has found allies in unlikely places. The Cold War is over, and I'm the first one to mention places like Syria, Burma, Belarus, China, even places like Sudan a few years ago, run by nationalist and national socialist governments who would remind you very much of 1930s governments throughout Europe. There's little difference today between China run by the party and South Korea under General Park. And I keep hearing these conservatives, even some paleocons, condemning China from a liberal point of view, demanding things like free divorce and freedom of expression, and for some reason, condemning public executions. I had a big debate on Facebook with a good friend of mine who said that I was doing a terrible thing by defending China because of their behavior in Tibet. I didn't know this guy took the Tibetan case so seriously. But I said, I guess you've never heard of General Sherman's March to the Sea. Because governments tend not to react very well when you have secessionist movements in huge parts of their territory, especially when these secessionist movements are so blatantly financed from abroad. That's one of these debates where, we've known each other for a long time, but it's odd. And I think it comes down to the fact that most people don't realize what's happened in China since the late 70s. A brand new constitution was written in 1978. And as I mentioned before, Deng Xiaoping had to realize and had no choice but to realize that places like South Korea, Singapore, and especially Taiwan were blowing China away, economically speaking. And therefore, now that Mao had died in 76 and the Gang of Four was purged, and how ironic that the Gang of Four included Mao's wife, second wife, or third, whatever it was, were thrown in prison. They've all since died of natural causes. They were elderly at the time. And of course, they were purged in a show trial, which made me laugh because they had done that to their enemies many, many times. So it's odd that I don't think people realize what's happened in China since 78. But the truth of the matter is the U.S. is the center of global liberalism. That's what the U.S. is. U.S. foreign policy, we've talked about official documents from the Pentagon, from the Defense Department, talking about defending liberalism as the primary purpose of the U.S. military. I've quoted this 1,000 times in 1,000 different contexts. So what's the opposition to American global liberalism? Well, we're not strong enough to do anything from the inside, so it falls to other countries. Places like China, like Syria, like Burma, like, even years earlier, places like when the military was running South Korea, and even Taiwan decades ago. These are the only places, whether their governments are called, social nationalist or even, National Bolshevik in a very eccentric way. But you can't even say that about China today. Some kind of social nationalist idea, including another Burma, actually called themselves National Socialists at one point prior to the Slork movement. So they came right out and said, I don't know how the translation from Burmese looks, but everyone at the time said this was a National Socialist Party that the military had put together. So, like it or not, the U.S. is the font of evil in the world because it's the globe's center of liberalism. I've been condemned as an advocate for a foreign government, which, by the way, I take as high praise. I most certainly am. Because the United States, in building its empire, justified it by building an empire based on liberalism. As many of you know, and I've been through this 1,000 times, these Protestant missionaries in Russia and China and elsewhere have gone to prison, not because they're Christians. Christianity is quite legal in China. There's a huge Orthodox church in Pyongyang, North Korea, sponsored by the government of Russia, of course. It's that some of these Protestants have gone to jail. There's one in jail in Turkey. There's a bunch in Russia. There's a bunch all over the place, especially in China, because these evangelical movements are usually covers for the CIA. That's why that so-called pastor is still in jail in Turkey. A bunch of them are in prison in Iran allegedly for being agents, because these Protestant evangelical movements are radically neocon, are extremely Zionist, and are often connected with U.S. military circles. So this is why these groups are being sent to prison. If you are, a homegrown, ordinary religious group, you don't normally get into any kind of trouble. Obviously, in the Tibetan case, this has more to do with the U.S. involvement in the secessionist movement there, not because they're Buddhists. Same thing for the CIA-controlled Yellowbird, Operation Yellowbird movements amongst the Muslims in Western China. It's all the same thing. And now there's certainly other operations other than Yellowbird where the CIA is involved in building the resistance to China. Not because it's Marxist, because there was no such resistance when China actually was Marxist. When Mao killed 30 million people, the U.S. didn't say a word, and trade with China was free completely. The minute they shed Marxism, the minute they stopped slaughtering dissidents, all of a sudden it becomes a problem. All of a sudden, China is this big scourge to the world. Not when Mao was alive. Not when Nixon first visited there. Not at that point. Only when they shed all this, only when the Gang of Four went to jail, all of a sudden the U.S. government begins to realize that China might be a problem. And when you have illiterates like Lindsey Graham talking about China as if Mao is still alive, and you have people who are the simple fact, look, as I mentioned, Mao exploded his nuclear weapon in 1964, right in the middle of his mass murders at their height. And the Gang of Four, by the way, was involved in the Cultural Revolution. No one said a word. No one condemned them for this. And yet, if nationalist Iran even thinks about it, it's cause for war. China is challenged because it's nationalist. If it were a communist state, it would be subsidized by the U.S., not attacked by it. And this is the case, whether it be China, Belarus, any of the countries in Central Asia, any member of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And if you notice how the media approaches the American population, as I said already, I've said it elsewhere, they approach liberals and they talk about public executions and how terrible the Buddhists are being treated, for no reason, of course. They go to conservatives and say they want to take over the world and they're anti-American. And this is how the regime builds a cause for war. And my prediction is this is going to get worse and worse and worse. The regime is going to be going to both factions with a different tale each time, because depending on how long this lasts, now in my state of Pennsylvania, they're talking about, I think, the first or second week in May is when the lockdown is going to end. Now I'm pretty sure that's contingent. Some people are predicting Memorial Day weekend. It really depends on how the numbers are being reported. But if this lasts any longer than that, and the economy collapses entirely, even worse than it already has, California has already reported 30% of its GDP somehow disappeared because there's this total lack of economic activity. That as this gets worse and worse, especially if it lasts beyond May, what's going to happen is China is going to become front page news daily. And you'll see various stories told about it. Again, Johnson's Law being what it is, they're going to just assume that Americans don't really know anything, so they could pretty much say whatever they want, blame it on China, and, well, no one listens to me, so who's going to tell them otherwise? They never even go to the embassy. You figure that a reporter should go to the embassy at least to get their point of view whenever they report on something like this. They don't even do that. They go to NGOs, liberal activist groups, and this is where they get their information. Every enemy of the U.S. that's ever existed, from the Civil War on, they want to take over the world. It all comes from James Bond movies. With one exception. The communists. Which, by the way, actually do want to take over the world. China is building a state based on, as they say officially, socialism with Chinese characteristics. As I've said before, that is identical to their version of National Socialism. China has ceased being a communist state a long time ago, and right now it's one of the few places where global liberalism is being attacked from a very powerful, very strong government allied with Russia and Belarus and elsewhere. A huge proportion of the globe's economy, of the globe population, is now a part of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and is going to continue to build this anti-liberal movement against the Western world, which is controlled by people like the Bilderberg Society and groups like this that have the trillionaires which are in charge, whether it be of media or academia or elsewhere. That's what's happening there. That's what China is, and that's what the U.S. is. So thank you, everyone, for listening. I'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye.